My name is Bill Pierce, and I'm along with Bill Baker. We are here today as part of the History Project of the Society for Vascular Surgery. The goal of that project is to interview outstanding clinical vascular surgeons and leaders in our field. And today we're pleased to have with us Dr. Richard Cambria, who is professor of surgery at the Harvard Medical School. He's a division chief of vascular and endovascular surgery at the Mass General Hospital, immediate past president of the Society for Vascular Surgery, associate editor of the Journal for Vascular Surgery. So we're very pleased to have you here today with us, Richard.
Thanks very much, Bill. And Bill, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's a great honor to be asked to be here.
We're pleased that you're here. Dr. Cambria is really, truly a triple threat. He has more than 200 publications. He is a renowned surgeon in the area of thoracoabdominal surgery, and he's a recognized teacher. So with that as a background, I want to start with sort of the beginnings, Richard, like where you were born, your early family life, and what led you from there to here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in New Jersey, and my parents were first generation born in this country. My grandparents were all born in Italy. So my upbringing was typical of that generation, being driven by our parents to succeed and work hard and those sorts of things. And so I'm one of four brothers, and my mother and father always used to tell us you need to be either a doctor or a lawyer because they're the most successful, and of the four of us there are two Ivy League educated lawyers and there are two vascular surgeons, so I guess you can say we listened to mom and dad. I was heavily influenced in my early years by my dad, who took me to work with him in the family butcher shop when I was 12 years old. And as I said in my presidential address, there are profound influences on most of us, usually early in life, that we can trace back the essence of who we are and our life story. And in my case, it was very much going to work in the butcher shop with my father. My father also taught me the principles of traction and counter-traction when he taught me how to cut up a chicken. So my career in surgery was launched at an early age. But in a very real and practical sense, my dad used to deliver meat and groceries to the Sisters of Charity, who ran a operation known as the St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And through that connection, I got a job as a surgical technician working in an operating room at age 19 after my first year in college. So I've been in operating rooms since I was 19, and I've known since that time that I always wanted to be a surgeon. So I was very lucky in that entire string of events to be introduced to surgery and to really fall in love with surgery, even as a pre-medical student in college.
Now, how did you wind up at Holy Cross?
Same kind of variation on the story. I grew up in a little town called Roselle, New Jersey. I went to a Catholic boys' high school where all the boys wore jackets and ties to every class every day. But no one from that school had ever gone to an Ivy League college, for example. And my dad found this small Jesuit college in Massachusetts, and all four of his sons ultimately went there. And at the time, and still now, it had a strong tradition in pre-professional education, and it positioned me well when the time came for me to go to medical school.
Now, where did you meet your wife with all those boys' schools there?
Well, I met my wife through one of my college friends who was a classmate at Holy Cross. He was from Vermont, and early on I was a freshman or a sophomore in college, and I went up to Vermont skiing. So I met her again when I was something like 20 years of age through that connection.
Now you have 5 children?
We have 5 children. At the present time, they go from 23 to 33. But only our youngest, my daughter, is in the healthcare professions. She's currently in graduate school has one more year to go to get her nurse practitioner degree.
Now, who did you work with during those summer things as a surgical technician?
Well, it's interesting. We're talking about 1970. So at the time, I remember vividly a surgeon at the hospital doing this new thing called a femoral popliteal bypass, where a vein graft was threaded through a bronchoscope from the groin to the below-knee popliteal artery. At that time, of course, most people who did vascular surgery also did general surgery. And in the hospital where I worked at, there were femoral popliteal bypasses and that sort of thing, but not really a lot of vascular surgery. But in medical school, I had the great fortune, and I'll never forget this, to scrub on a Saturday morning with Arthur B. Voorhees. And Voorhees, of course, was one of the giants in our field and who really authored the first description in the early 50s of the use of an artificial cloth prosthesis to replace the aorta. And that, of course, is one of the single most important contributions in the history of vascular surgery. I went to medical school convinced I would be a cardiac surgeon. You're going to climb a tree, climb the highest tree, and all that sort of thing. I was only dissuaded when I did a sub-internship at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, with two giants in New York City in the field of cardiac surgery, Jim Malm and Freddie Bowman. The service at that time consisted about 70% of congenital heart work, and I thought I wanted to be a congenital heart surgeon. But I realized during that sub-internship how the cardiac surgeon operated practically in the care of patients as a highly skilled technician, and the cardiologist did all the thinking and the workup and the triaging of patients, and frankly that turned me off towards cardiac surgery. As a senior medical student then, I had the opportunity to do a sub-internship in vascular surgery at the Mass General under Dr. R. Clement Darling, who would ultimately become my professional godfather, as it were. And after I did that, I was sold on vascular surgery as the field that had both terrific surgery and totality of patient care. So that's what hooked me on vascular surgery.
How did you make the decision to work with Dr. Darling?
Well, it was somewhat serendipitous. I had done sub-internships in cardiac surgery, GI surgery at Columbia Presbyterian, and of course I was interested in surgical training, and all of my advisors told me that if you wanted to go to the best surgery training program, you better strut your stuff at the Fruit Street Clinic, which is what they referred to the MGH in New York City. And I was lucky enough to do the sub-internship in vascular surgery, and then with the strong support of Dr. Darling, I was lucky enough to be appointed to the house staff the following summer.
Tell me a little bit more about that surgery with Dr. Voorhees. Did he use his own graft? Did he give you the history of how that operation was done?
He was a very soft-spoken man, and I remember distinctly that I was on two big Diva retractors, and at that point, again, we're talking the early 70s, so he had been into this for 20 years since his description of the use of an artificial prosthetic, but by that time, of course, they were commercially available Dacron graft products. But it was before there were things like collagen impregnated Dacron grafts, and I remember vividly the whole pre-clotting routine before you would implant a Dacron graft, which today seems like ancient history.
Now, you went to the Mass General to do your residency and eventually stayed on after a short stint in Yale.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about the history of vascular surgery there at the General.
Well, I subsequently learned, of course, of the terrific tradition in, I'll call it, vascular disease management at the MGH. The very first clinic run and organized by surgeons dedicated to the care of vascular disease was started at the Mass General in 1928 by a man by the name of Arthur Allen. Arthur Allen would go on to be the second president of the SVS. He was also one of that group of 6 people who held an organizational meeting at the Southern Surgical Association December 1945, right after the end of the Second World War, with the intent of getting together a professional society devoted to vascular disease management. Allen was a man, a surgeon of all seasons. He had a wide range of interests in gastrointestinal disease and a special interest in vascular disease. He was writing about periarterial sympathectomy in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which would subsequently become the New England Journal of Medicine in the 1920s. Looking back in history, he delivered a paper before the American Medical Association in 1928 on the use of typhoid vaccine injection to augment peripheral circulation in people with thromboangiitis obliterans. And amazingly enough, it actually worked and healed gangrene in some of these patients. But his real reputation was forged in the management of, or the prophylaxis of, pulmonary embolism. And in 1943, before the American Surgical Association, he delivered his series of over 200 patients treated with femoral vein interruption to prophylax pulmonary embolism. And near as I can tell, this was the first direct operation on blood vessels, aside from things like amputations, that was performed at the MGH. Robert Linton, who joined the staff in 1931, would soon become a protege and confidant of Arthur Allen, and they were 2 of the 31 founding charter members of the Society for Vascular Surgery at the time of its first meeting in 1947.
And then Clem Darling came, and I think he had a great impact on your career.
Right. Well, Clem, as he likes to say, was the first graduate of Boston University Medical School to be appointed to the house staff at Mass General, which of course in those days was totally dominated by Harvard types. And when I went to do a sub-internship with Clem Darling, you can imagine my trepidation. Here I was going to Boston to do a sub-internship with this man with the waspy, lofty-sounding name of R. Clement Darling Jr. III, and my name ended in a vowel. Well, but of course, Darling was not lofty and snooty. He was irascible, irreverent, and he had no liking for what we would know today as political correctness. So accordingly, we hit it off tremendously. And Darling, in turn, had finished his training at the Mass General in the late 50s, and Dr. Churchill, who was the department chair at the time, sent him to Houston to do a 2-year fellowship with Michael DeBakey, with the intent that he would come back and join Linton, who by that time was doing things like direct repairs of aortic aneurysm. So Darling came back and joined Linton as a partner in 1960. And by the time I got to the Mass General as a sub-intern in September of 1976, Linton had retired, and Darling had an enormous practice of vascular surgery really before there were trained vascular surgeons outside of academic medical centers.
Now, somewhere in the mix is Stan Crawford.
Dr. Crawford and Dr. Darling were on the house staff at the same time together. Dr. Crawford was chief resident at the Mass General in 1955, and in those days it was up to the super chief residents to try new things out. And legend has it that Dr. Crawford did one of the first aortic aneurysm replacements at the Mass General when he was chief resident in 1955, but immediately thereafter went to join Dr. DeBakey in Houston, and he told Dr. DeBakey that he wanted his thing to be aortic surgery. The circle came around full because Dr. Crawford's son John and I were chief residents at Mass General together. And John had spent a year with his dad doing a fellowship in Houston, so that when he came back to be chief resident at Mass General, I felt that I got all of Dr. Crawford's trainings and techniques via proxy through his son John, who was a good friend of mine.
Is that where you think you started your career in thoracoabdominal aneurysm repair? Is that history is part of it?
It is part of it because in the early 80s, direct thoracoabdominal aneurysm repair was not something that was done very successfully in New England, in Boston, or the Mass General. And it was only after we adopted Dr. Crawford's techniques, and we're talking about the early to mid 80s now, that we began to get good results with this. And because of that tradition, when I came back to the full-time staff at the Mass General in October of 1986, Dr. Darling had sort of a stack of thoracoabdominal aneurysm patients that he turned over to me. And I always felt that I owed my start in central aortic surgery to Dr. Darling because of that.
One of your seminal contributions has been the spinal cord's cooling and drainage. Tell us about how you came on that.
Well, when we got into the issue of central aortic surgery, of course the unsolved problem was spinal cord ischemic complications. And I followed Dr. Crawford's work very closely, and as you know, he did a number of trials looking at things like CSF drainage, looking at things like extracorporeal circulation, but he finished his career fundamentally frustrated with the complication of spinal cord ischemia. And in his monumental series of 1,500 patients, the total spinal cord ischemic complication rate was 16%, and about half of those had the total devastating paraplegia. So we certainly recognize that that was really the unsolved problem. You know, in terms of getting a patient through this operation, if you did the operation well and your cross-clamp times were brief and your blood turnover was acceptable, you know, the patients would do all right, but solving the spinal cord ischemic problem was a mountain that was yet to be climbed. So we devised a technique of regional hypothermic protection for the spinal cord in conjunction with my partner in vascular anesthesia, Dr. J. Kenneth Davison. And this was based on experimental work. We applied it in humans, and technically we could do that. During the period of aortic cross-clamp complication, we could have the spinal fluid cooled to 28 degrees centigrade, which incrementally was a major protective window compared to keeping the patient normothermic or with modest systemic hypothermia. And although our results were much improved compared to earlier work, we still couldn't get the cord ischemia complication rate to under 8% or so. So eventually, and this has been a topic of our research and re-examining this question over and over again, ultimately, Dr. Randy Greep and others laid the foundation for the collateral network concept of spinal cord protection. And so today we do the operation with distal aortic perfusion, continuous CSF drainage, and intraoperative monitoring of motor evoked potentials. Techniques and rationales, if you will, that have changed continuously over a 25, 30-year period. And today, literally, we delivered a paper last week in our last 100 patients. We have spinal cord ischemic complications well under 5%. So it's not a solved problem, but it's a gradually improving problem.
Now, what I find remarkable is here is a fantastic open surgeon who now becomes division chief right at the cusp of the endovascular revolution. Tell me how you dealt with all of that.
All right, so that was clearly the turning point, the benchmark. That was the issue for vascular surgery in the early 90s. And as a specialty, and each vascular surgeon as an individual had to figure out how they would deal with it. At the time, I certainly had a large enough practice of open vascular surgery that I could have ignored it and left it to younger surgeons, but I didn't consider myself old at the time, being about 50. So and it was the fortuitous advent of stent graft repair of aortic aneurysm that really demonstrated to me that endovascular surgery was not only effective, part of the armamentarium, but would clearly take over a lot of traditional open vascular surgery.
Now, you went off and trained yourself somewhere.
I did.
Where'd you go?
I spent a postgraduate mini fellowship in endovascular therapy with Dan Clare and Roy Greenberg at the Cleveland Clinic.
Did they make you an intern?
I was close to an intern. I worked very hard at this, and they were in the awkward position of having a professor of surgery as their pupil. They absolutely correctly identified the fact that if you really want to be expert in this, you need to immerse yourself in it. So I lived in a motel at the Cleveland Clinic for 6 weeks. I'll never forget it because it was right after 9/11/2001. The airports were all deserted. National Guardsmen with machine gun were the people that were in the airports on Sunday evenings when I would travel to Cleveland. But I did immerse myself in it, so coincident with that, several of my partners did similar things, so we changed the practice of vascular surgery and vascular interventions at our hospital beginning about 10, 12 years ago. And of course, that's been replicated by vascular surgeons all over the country. And it was a defining moment for the specialty. And because we had the tradition of managing patients longitudinally, we were able to pull that off. And today, of course, it's an absolutely essential component of who we are and what we do.
Now, when you became division chief, you changed the name, and you made some substantive changes to the program. Tell us a little bit about your leadership at the Mass General.
Well, the changes in the program were, at that time, and we're talking January 2002, I was lucky enough to be named the division chief, and we had a couple of decisions to make. The principal one, of course, was how we would deal with what I refer to as the endovascular revolution. And as I just said, I felt strongly that we had to deal with it by making a vascular surgery division a full-service division of traditional open and catheter-based endovascular techniques. So that's what we did. And there was a certain amount of awkwardness in that because, like many vascular surgeons, for a long time I had been referring things like iliac angioplasties to interventional radiologists, but we had always admitted those patients to our service, done all their preoperative investigation, triaging, and workup, and then followed them longitudinally. So it was only natural that with catheter and guide wire skills that we would take care of their intervention as well. The other issue that I had to face at that time is what would be the role of fundamental basic science research in our division. And I was fortunate, and I felt strongly that an academic division of vascular surgery had to have that as part of its core component and mission. So I was lucky enough to recruit Mike Watkins, and we now have, as part of our division, an NIH-funded basic research laboratory, which may not be important for many or even most environments, but for ours I felt it was. So those were the two major issues to deal with, and then to repopulate the faculty. And the faculty very rapidly became composed of all of us who could do both open and endovascular surgery, because you can't pull this off if there's one person who's endovascular capable.
Now you're just the immediate past president of the Society for Vascular Surgery. How have you used those leadership skills you learned at the Mass General, at the national level, and local level?
Well, the first thing to say about leadership in the SVS is that following the critically important merger to which we owe Jack Cronenweth and Tom Riles extreme gratitude, the leadership structure of SVS evolved such that the leaders are in essentially a 3-year rotation. Vice President, President-elect, and then President, all of those people continuously being on the executive committee. And for the many issues that SVS deals with, that history and continuity among leadership is critically important, because many issues that one deals with as SVS president will start before and go beyond your tenure as president, and we've seen multiple examples of that over the past few years. I felt as president that I had to have a direction and a pet project that would be my own. The direction kind of fell upon me, as it were, in the carotid space. My presidency landed us as a specialty historically at a critical time in the carotid arena. And some of the events referable to that were the publication of the CREST study and really intense scrutiny on regulatory and CMS payment issues. So that became a very important part of my tenure as president, not only on the scientific basis, but also in terms of research priorities for our society, and in the sometimes thorny issue of relations with other specialists and other professional societies. There was a bit of an imbroglio related to guideline documents referable to carotid disease. But I think that as a specialty and as a society, we stayed the course. We stuck with the data based on our foundation as really being the experts in this disease process. I felt it was then appropriate because of this to focus on it in my presidential address. The other thing that I took on as a bit of a pet project was to push one of our strategic goals, which was articulated back in 2008, namely to increase the numbers of vascular surgeons. Our specialty has been highly successful, and if one looks at the barometer of job opportunities for graduating vascular fellows, and if one looks at the issue of competition with other specialists, the only way that we can solidify our position and the care of patients is to increase the numbers of fully trained vascular surgeons. So we put together a task force, and I think we had a fair degree of success in identifying places and programs and individuals who could develop vascular fellowships where there are none at the moment. Because the numbers of our graduates has been relatively flat over the past 8 to 10 years. So I think we're on the uptick on that, and that's a critical part of our future.
We also hear that the number of applicants for fellowships is relatively stable. It's not increasing by leaps and bounds. We're not turning people away. How should we address that issue?
Well, two ways. And of course, the answer to your question today is separated into two buckets of applicants, if you will. The 05 integrated vascular residency has been a fabulously successful training paradigm, at least as gauged by the enthusiasm of the applicant pool. We just turned out this past July our first product, so I guess time will tell what kind of product that will be. But the 05 vascular residency is one of the most successful, most avidly applied to AAMC specialty training programs. So we seem to be in very good shape with that applicant pool. Applicants to the 5+2 traditional vascular fellowship have been relatively flat and have been just enough to fill the pool over the past couple of years. My personal feeling is that we need to keep both of these training tracks open well into the future to continue to have the broadest appeal to talented people who want to do vascular surgery. Anecdotally, I certainly talk to many applicants who have only decided on a career in vascular surgery well into their general surgery training. So I think it would be very short-sighted to make that training track disappear as 05s mature. At the present time, there are something like 41 05 training programs open, and what those programs will do with their 5+2 fellowships is a little bit all over the board. Some intend to simply stop it. Some intend to keep the tracks open. I personally think it's a great strategy for a total net increase in the number of trained vascular surgeons, namely keeping both tracks open.
Now, your long career, you must have had a few setbacks. There must have been some bumps in the roads. How did you deal with those? What was it about your personality and characteristics and upbringing that got you through some tough times?
Well, I think probably the single biggest issue, and as I travel across the country and talk to vascular surgeons, the single biggest issue is vascular surgeons dealing with the fact that other specialists can and do treat vascular disease today. That is something that's viscerally objectionable to many vascular surgeons, in particular when they witness, and it's usually in the realm of catheter-based interventions, people who have a technical skill but perhaps not the cognitive background to deal with that. And I've had to deal with that in my own institution, in my own city, and I'm a simple surgeon, so I have a simple way of dealing with it, and it goes something like this. The only way that you can successfully compete with them is to be better than them. And vascular surgeons can be better than them because they have the appropriate training to do so. Even today, our cardiology brothers who graduate vascular training do 1 year of technical fellowship after an interventional cardiology fellowship. And I believe that those people are not well equipped to compete with vascular surgeons in total patient management in vascular disease. So that's an ongoing issue.
The carotid issue, of course, comes up repeatedly. Where do we stand today in our, if I were to write a position paper, what should I put in my position paper?
Well, I think we collectively have already done that when the Society for Vascular Surgery published its updated practice guidelines in September of 2011. This was, of course, an ongoing process because we had published a practice guideline in 2008 and it needed updating because of new information. The information available to date, at least in my view, is that carotid endarterectomy remains the standard of care for most patients in most clinical scenarios. There's great controversy, as you know, about the appropriate role of carotid angioplasty and stenting, which I personally consider at the moment, at the day of this interview, a procedure in evolution. That evolution is not complete. In my opinion, distal protection as a protection strategy has failed, as evidenced by the available data to date. However, I think it's going to get better. The irony of this is that at the moment, I am personally the national principal investigator for a new carotid stent strategy that involves direct cervical cut down on the carotid with a short sheath, high flow reversal system for protection. So we shall see, as they say. But at the moment, I think if we stick to the data, the role of carotid endarterectomy today remains evidence-based and the standard of care, in my view.
I don't think we're getting that message out to a lot of our colleagues in other specialties. What do you think about them?
Well, as you know, my personal opinion is that much of this debate in Firestorm has very little to do with what's best for patients and has much more to do about specialties gaining market share in this procedure or this disease process and so forth. I've studied this question and the available data very closely, and it escapes me how any physician can recommend a procedure for a patient with symptomatic carotid stenosis that has a twofold increased risk of stroke and death compared to carotid endarterectomy. And the attempt to mitigate that fact by introducing soft or what I consider irrelevant endpoints such as periprocedural myocardial infarction is at least intellectually disingenuous and perhaps morally objectionable.
On to a different topic. In your presidential address, you emphasized the role that your past has influenced you, your upbringing, and you, in essence, said that we are who we are today on the basis of what we've done in the past in our family, etc. When you go to choose vascular fellows in residence, Do you just look at the test scores, or what? How do you evaluate them?
Well, I said, Bill, in that presidential address that I am continually amazed and impressed at the individual life stories of people that come to apply, for example, for our fellowship. You know, leaders lead based on their own life story and experiences. And some of the things I've read about this, you know, I didn't really come up with that myself, but I read some things that that made me say, aha. For example, the influence of my father. You know, when you're a kid, a child, even a young man, you don't really realize the influence of your parents and your upbringing and your opportunities until you have a chance to reflect and look back on that. And that sort of realization came for me during the popularization of the so-called greatest generations, the writing of Stephen Ambrose and Tom Brokaw and others. But when I look at the people that come to apply for internship or vascular fellowships, I, in one sense, see myself in a lot of them. And even today, last year, 3 of our 4 vascular fellows were women. They all happened to be Asian women, and they all had terrific life stories, including some who escaped from Vietnam with their parents when they were 9 years old and who came to this country with literally nothing and got to the point of being a vascular fellow at the Mass General based on their own work and achievements. Those are the types of life stories that I identify with in our talented young people, and of course our collective task is to keep people like that interested in becoming vascular surgeons.
And to keep them interested in the Society for Vascular Surgery, because if we don't support our society, we go down the tubes, I guess.
Well, I think that SVS has done a very good job over the past few years of getting our trainees in the fold while they're in training, so that it's almost automatic today.
Well, you've had a very illustrious career, Dr. Cambria. What's the next chapter?
Well, you know, I haven't given that one too much thought. At the moment, I'm immersed in running my division, and I do think that my time with the SVS perhaps took me a little bit away from some of my younger faculty, so I need to kind of reconnect and support them, because that's what a division chief, that's the division chief's single most important duty in terms of his faculty, to ensure that their careers can evolve and develop in a way that doesn't necessarily have to be like our generation. I take great interest in the fact that I want my young faculty, even if they have 4 children, to have a life where that family life is at least as important as their professional life. So that's a big task of mine. At the moment, the next edition of Rutherford and another textbook is on the docket. So I don't really know what will happen when it's time for me to stop running the division at the Mass General. I've had such a great year, and as a sort of full circle thing at the MGH, just 2 weeks ago we inaugurated the Robert R. Linton Professorship in Vascular and Endovascular Surgery at the Mass General and the Harvard Medical School, and I was lucky enough to be the first incumbent to that chair. So internally in the hospital, I think that there will be other things as healthcare changes, how the care of populations of patients changes. So I might be interested in doing something on the hospital side towards that goal at some point for the next step. But for right now, I think I got plenty to do with my own division.
Well, thank you. Dr. Cambria,
Thank
thank you
you.
for your time.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bill.